Hey listeners, let's talk about revolutionizing your mining operation with Foreman. This isn't your average management tool. It's an all-in-one solution for reducing costs and significantly boosting your revenue. Foreman brings a cutting-edge dashboard to your fingertips, empowering you with automated energy strategies. This means not only curtailing around real-time prices, but also strategically enhancing your profit margins through demand response. It's about leveraging energy efficiency to its fullest potential. With Foreman, you get a system that scales with your business, inventory management for assets, infrastructure integration, and business intelligence. Foreman elevates the cash flow and production of your entire operation. To see how Foreman can redefine your mining operation standards, visit foreman.mn. With Foreman, you're not just managing a mining operation, you're setting a new standard in the industry.
Accelerated by Compass is the premier accelerator program for Bitcoin mining sites at any stage of development. Our managed services provide expert guidance in site procurement, construction, energy agreements, and mining operations. Compass helps clients meet timelines and expectations for operational excellence, from greenfield to retrofits and everything in between. Don't just mine, excel. Visit compassmining.io now to discover how Accelerated by Compass can power your success.
Are you a retail or institutional investor interested in Bitcoin mining companies? The Miner Mag brings you free data and analysis from all major NASDAQ-listed Bitcoin mining operations to know who stands out. Check out visualized metrics and data-dependent stories at theminermag.com.
Welcome back to the Mining Pod. Charlie here, not Will. He is in Miami at Mining Disrupt. Have you ever wondered how that big Taproot Wizard JPEG got on Bitcoin in the first place? It kicked off a year and a half of discussion on Bitcoin consensus. Should there be NFTs or JPEGs on Bitcoin? Are they clogging the blockchain? What are the mechanics of a transaction like that actually getting on Bitcoin in the first place? So I had a fascinating conversation with Portland Hodl, who built the Slipstream product for Marathon Digital and has generated significant fee revenue to their pool, Mara Pool. This is a very interesting hour and a half long conversation. So if you normally pay attention to like mining efficiencies and ASIC production, this might be an interesting episode to listen to in full because we get into the weeds about how Bitcoin works under the hood. So stick around. We will be hearing advertisements from our sponsors. Thank you to CleanSpark and Foreman Mining for supporting the Mining Pod. You'll hear from them throughout the episode. Otherwise, sit back and listen to this re-aired episode of Bitcoin Season 2. Welcome, Portland Hodl, to Bitcoin Season 2.
Thank you, Charlie, for having me. Very excited to be here and looking forward to our conversation today. Hopefully, it's going to be about a little bit of Slipstream, maybe some consensus and relay policy. Who knows? Future Softforks.
Yeah, it could be all of those things. That's like the hot topic right now. But let's pull back. Like I want to make this approachable to the ordinals, the NFT folks, even like the traditional non-technical Bitcoiners. We may have to talk about Bitcoin consensus and relay policy, but maybe just to lay a foundation. What are your views on Bitcoin in general? Like, how do you think about Bitcoin? Why Bitcoin? And then why did you end up building Slipstream?
My views about Bitcoin are specifically that Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer version of electronic cash. Like literally as a white paper says. I do believe that is the ultimate use case for Bitcoin. But secondary to that is that it is censorship resistant freedom money, right? And as such, like that entails permissionlessness and kind of all the other properties of not having an actual governance structure or like a top-down enforcement mechanism for the way transactions or Bitcoin should be used. And going on Twitter, like especially in 21, 22, that was my first exposure to the public culture of Bitcoin, not the private, like working on the GitHub and kind of Bitcoin talk, but actual like communication, free-flowing, real-time, especially over Twitter Spaces. And like, it really kind of got in my head during that period of time that like Bitcoin is literally for anybody to do whatever they want with, as long as it's within the consensus rules of Bitcoin. Like I always heard the term Bitcoin is for your friends as it is for your enemies. And I really latched onto that because in everything in life, there's some sort of governance system on, okay, well, this is the actual total scope of things you can do, but you actually are only permitted to do like a much smaller section of that. And, so yeah, I believe that at the end of the day, Bitcoin is money. Bitcoin is also a database of money that's programmable. And as such, like this is kind of the more technical side of it. But you can program Bitcoin to do things. And I don't want to restrict anybody's use of Bitcoin for any reason beyond the consensus limits of what actually Satoshi set out that Bitcoin is like the rules, like what kind of programs you can write on Bitcoin. I don't think that's my position to tell anybody how to use their Bitcoin. And like even like going like a little bit deeper, like I'm ask you a question, like if Bitcoin had no value at all, like you couldn't exchange it for money or anything like that, what would be the only thing you can do with your Bitcoin? Like what's the intrinsic use case for Bitcoin?
Communication, I guess.
You're pretty close. It's writing data to the blockchain. You can bribe miners. That's literally it. Like if you have one Bitcoin, the only value of that Bitcoin technically is how many bytes could you write to the time chain? And that doesn't necessarily mean arbitrary data. You could write transactions to that time chain using that one Bitcoin. But you like, for example, I could take my one Bitcoin and send it to myself. Okay, I have less than one Bitcoin now because I had to bribe the miner. I could do it again and again and again and again. I would run out of Bitcoin. But in the process of doing that, I basically create this like trail of data. That's the only actual use case of Bitcoin, is like writing data to this database of money and programmable definitions of what that money can do. And like other utilities, for example, gold, you could smash it into a watch or a chain, but most people say it should be money. That's like Bitcoin's intrinsic use case is literally writing data. And as such, like concluding all that, Bitcoin is literally the freedom to write data as long as you can bribe the miner. Like that's what it boils down to.
It's almost the other term I hear, and Satoshi used this. It's a distributed timestamp server.
Correct.
As well. So it's an ordering events. So let's get into Slipstream. I mean,
sure. Yeah.
Let's just go right there. I mean, try to keep it simple. Like, what is Slipstream at a high level? And then why did you build Slipstream?
So Slipstream at a high level is basically the ability for a user to directly submit their transactions to a miner. Regularly in Bitcoin, if you have a transaction and you broadcast it, you don't send it right to a miner. You actually kind of ping pong along the network and all these nodes, and eventually it gets to a miner. And the miner adds that to their mempool because it pays fees and they want to collect fees. And so, yeah, basically what this is, it's basically saying your transaction's down here, Marathon's up here, just go straight A to B, and you can directly submit it with a little bit of an extra fee. So it's kind of think of like an overnight shipping service for transactions versus going through the postal service where you'll have a bunch of hubs along the way. Marathon literally drives the truck out to your house and picks up the transaction, drives it back to Marathon. Like it's fully in Marathon's control. There's no like USPS, the shipping hubs, like, oh, my package went here to like Arkansas, then ended up back in Texas, just to go back to California kind of thing. And the package is representative of a transaction. As a part of that process, though, of doing a direct submission, there's some unique properties that kind of became apparent. First of all, we're not bound to the rules of shipping or relay policy on the Bitcoin network. So nodes, I'm going to kind of use the analogy of packages here, have rules on them. So as I said, like normally you go all across the network to all these nodes and eventually hit a miner. Well, each node along that route has a set of rules defining what kind of packages or transactions that it can accept. Because these transactions can actually be pretty nasty and cause problems for these nodes to kind of not operate successfully or slow down too much to be able to take in more transactions. Like people could be malicious with this on low-end hardware. So with that said, that's the equivalent of like, you may have a package, but you go down to USPS here in the United States and they say, hey, does your package have lithium batteries? Well, to you, you say yes. And they go, we're not going to take that transaction or that package because that's too dangerous for us to take as a part of our shipping routes. But other carriers will take that package and take those things and put them into or get them to their destination. Same thing with Slipstream is because Marathon has the computational power necessary to operate a mempool that can kind of take all these various packages. As long as it's in a box or a transaction that is valid to Bitcoin, it's still a package. We will take it and mine it. There are some carve-outs for some actual real dangerous packages or transactions because you can do pretty malicious things. But in general, like things such as writing arbitrary data to Bitcoin, that is not a denial of service vector that Marathon needs to be concerned about. And there is an opportunity to earn more Bitcoin because of that. So basically, Marathon created a direct route to ship transactions to them for an extra fee that also kind of lessens the restrictions of that relay policy. So we will take more types of transactions than anybody else, which actually adds to kind of my thoughts and feelings about earlier, like freedom money. nobody should be censoring this stuff. Like, we shouldn't be picking and choosing the winners and losers of like who gets to use what types of transactions. And as such, yeah, like Marathon kind of went with like, let's open up and be less like, I guess, less censoring, I guess you'd say, or like filtering, because we have a wider set of total transactions we'll accept compared to any other pool currently. And by the way, if I ever use the term we, like, I am a contractor of Marathon. I do not represent the brand, and my statements should be taken as such. Like, don't like, yeah, like I'm telling you that I'm saying from my perspective, working at Marathon, I'll try to make sure that differentiation is complete. I guess at the end of the day, that the final part about Slipstream that it enables is a private mempool, right? So that means users can directly submit transactions to Marathon, and they go into the Marathon mempool to get mined, but nobody else sees these transactions on the network, which is either kind of a really good thing if you're trying to not kind of tip somebody off in the mempool that, hey, I'm doing something, or make a large movement, but also can be problematic for fee estimation for other nodes, because you kind of have this miner that represents a very small percentage of the hash rate that has like this secret, like the fees are likely higher for them than anybody else. The reason why I'm okay with that being that way is Marathon isn't enough of a source of hash rate to really kind of impact overall fees, right? Like having one block like a week that creates like a basically displaces other transactions because the fees paid in that block were higher and it was private, nobody else could see it. I don't think that is causing any huge quality of life problems for Bitcoiners overall. And second, we do have an API open, and you can go to the Slipstream web portal and you can see the current fee rate that's in the Marathon mempool. So,
and we can get into like the further conversation about private mempools and the implications and what a healthy, robust Bitcoin network looks like. But yeah. I think you know, it's interesting that, and I love your analogy of the packages and like a messaging, like the kind of like almost like a mail delivery service, and because that actually I think helps a few of the hurdles when explaining mempool relay policy and things like Bitcoin Core standardness. But it's funny, and this feels a bit like just this conversation that comes up every time that there's a soft or hard fork or any kind of fork discussion in Bitcoin. That, and it all almost always seems to center around mempool relay policy. Can you just use a great analogy, but can you actually describe specifically what Bitcoin Core standardness is, what is mempool relay policy, and then the difference between Bitcoin consensus and Bitcoin Core standardness?
Explaining is standard. What is standard in Bitcoin? Basically, every node on Bitcoin has a function built into it, and it's called is standard. And think of it like a bouncer, okay? And it basically says, are you good enough to get in my mempool, or do you fit within the bounds of the mempool? And some transactions are cool enough, most are cool enough to fit in the mempool, but every once in a while, you get this weirdo who comes in, and the bouncer goes, you don't look very friendly. You're dressed weird, And it says, no, you're not getting accepted into the mempool. And so that is what the is standard function. It literally says, is this transaction standard? And if you are not standard as a transaction, you get removed from the node, and you do not get to pass into the event, right? And what happens if you go into the event, basically that is quote unquote your node, putting the transaction in the mempool, and also additionally relaying it to the next node as well, which will also do the exact same function again. They have their own bouncer. And as long as your transaction is part of this standard group, you should be able to go into each event all the way along, and eventually you'll get to a miner. But like I said, yeah, it's sometimes there are scripts or Bitcoin transactions. If you try to lock your thing up in a weird way, they don't quite like that, the nodes. And so is standard is a way to essentially filter transactions that go into the mempool, hence the name filter policy or relay policy, and typically associated with filtering. And the most common thing that I think people have demand for that gets filtered are going to be the 4 megabyte transactions. Right now on Bitcoin, the bouncer, quote unquote, for your mempool will say you can be 1/10 the size of the Bitcoin block, or 400,000 weight units. But there's a lot of demand for people to buy the entire block to run like a Bitcoin script and have that store so far data. But you could also do more interesting things like BitVM and actually execute code. But yeah, so that's a typical thing that a bouncer says, hey, or the is standard policy says, hey, we're not going to take that into our mempool. That's too big. That's heavy. That's problematic. It takes a lot of bandwidth. Just get rid of it. And so Marathon with Slipstream, we basically told the bouncer or the is standard function, we're cool with these things. Like, if you're 4 megabyte, you're welcome into our mempool. If you have 2 op returns, it's cool. Come into our mempool. But we will charge you a little extra because you're a little bit burdensome to us, right? Like, we want you, but we also know there's an arbitrage opportunity between, like, hey, this is still a valid Bitcoin transaction according to Bitcoin, but most nodes on the network will make this very difficult for you to get to a miner. And so, yeah, that's kind of what is standard is. It's a function to check if a Bitcoin transaction is standard. And kind of I guess I'll mention real quick the names of these standard ones, but you might hear of like legacy Bitcoin transactions that start with like a 1 in the address. These are typically like standard pay to witness script hash and pay to witness public key hash. These are the SegWit versions of these things, or a taproot transaction. These are all standard, and you will have, if you're doing these types of transactions and they're not too big, then they'll flow right across the network. You will never touch any of this stuff. But like, for example, one thing is with Taproot, you can actually create a non-standard Taproot transaction when, for example, you want to embed a JPEG into it. So this is where you take arbitrary data and then you do a special part in the tap script, op0, op-if, and then it doesn't execute that code, but it literally just stores that information on Bitcoin. And that, if you go above the standardness limits, so 400,000 weight units, then your transaction, if you send it off, the first node that it gets to very likely will go, nope, and it won't even enter the mempool. It won't go anywhere. And you'll notice your transaction won't show up on mempool.space. It won't get mined. It's DOA. That is what standardness is. Consensus is all things that are valid on Bitcoin. So basically, any Bitcoin script that isn't forbidden to create, right? And there are limits to that. One limit is, well, why is the limit 4 megabytes of data on Bitcoin, or 4 megabytes for a script? Well, that limit is consensus, because you can't actually create a block that is bigger than 4 megabytes. So you can think of like the difference between consensus policy and relay policy. Consensus policy is like physics on planet Earth, right? Like, we're bound to gravity. We're never going to change gravity. That's just a property of it, right? The fact is we have inertia, all these different properties, thermodynamics. Like, we interact within the system. Relay policy is the jurisdictional rule on how we need to interact within that system. So even though physics says you can open up a locked door with enough force, we do have rules to say, no, you don't or shouldn't do that, right? And that's kind of like relay policy is like the jurisdictional law. Consensus is physics. It's literally just the rule of Bitcoin. There is no greater set of rules in Bitcoin than consensus rules. And with that said, relay policy is always going to be smaller than basically consensus. So relay policy is like this big of a box. Consensus is the rest of the frame. So
I love this example you use of the bouncer. I've been personally struggling to kind of try to use a good analogy. And this is the best analogy I've heard. I'll try to, also add my own twist to it. And that,
sure.
Consensus for a bar is that you are a human. And the bouncer says, well, we don't want certain people who are drunk. They can be disorderly, but the weirdos, or even maybe the all ages folks, they could come in, but you got to be a little more careful. Sometimes you have to add some extra checks for if you want an all ages bar and also serve alcohol. And sometimes you're trying to curate a specific vibe. And it's just much easier to say, well, we're just going to use the conventional rules for allowing people in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there's good reason to have a bouncer at the bar, because not all people should be at at one of these places. And this gets into kind of how you now getting a little bit of the technical stuff, like how you actually build Slipstream, because you can't just like say all transactions which are valid.
Yeah, there are dangerous transactions out there.
Yeah, and so this gets into like how hard is it technically to build something like Slipstream, and like how do you navigate the reality that you're producing blocks which are about $250,000 each, so each one is like a pretty big you don't want to mess that up. you know, so
that
talk me through
email.
like exactly. Talk me through like the technical challenges you have when building and designing Slipstream.
So the first technical challenge to building Slipstream is you're going to be modifying Bitcoin Core and you're going to be relaxing that relay policy. But you need to make sure that you relax the relay policy in a way that is safe. And part of that was kind of getting a deep understanding of the different kind of transactions that are absolutely like, do not take these, because under no circumstance, like I know I'm open to like freedom of all transactions for Bitcoin, consensus valid, like we'll take it all. There are actually a class of transactions that I do believe would negatively impact Bitcoin to the point where you shouldn't mine them for any amount of money. Like this is a nation state attack on Bitcoin if these types of transactions happen. And these would be, first of all, putting in safeguards against, like once you turn off that standardness rule, putting in safeguards against specifically a quadratic hash attack. So that's a transaction with a bunch of legacy inputs that are sig hash single that you essentially can create a block that takes 12 to 14 seconds to validate. Not too bad, right? Because your node gets it, takes 12 seconds. One, not going to kill you. You're already downloading an IBD for like, 5 hours minimum, 2 weeks maximum. But if you get a lot of these in a row, that's problematic. And then there's a second class opcode separator that I'm not going to go into detail how it can be used, but you can get blocks to become hour-long blocks to validate. And that actually is pretty advantageous for a miner if you do release one of these, and really bad for node runners because of the fact that you could broadcast this block. And if other miners don't have their stuff set up right, they would take in this block and they would be spending a lot of time validating it while they're still working on the old block. And then your pool gets ahead because you've already validated. You know that that block is correct and you just continue to mine. So you get an hour to yourself while everybody else spins their wheels. That if you get one of these successfully into the network, all the nodes have to validate that. And that could be like an hour each during the IBD that you just increase that time per block. So those two types were the first, like, let's make sure that can't happen on Slipstream. So those were guarded against in Bitcoin Core, the implementation. And by the way, if you want further details as somebody who's interested in like standardness policy and Slipstream, the creation, look up the Great Consensus Cleanup by Matt Corello. It's called the Great Consensus Cleanup. You can Google it, and there's a new person's kind of championing that bit, Antoine. But this outlines some of the consensus or the physics of Bitcoin, or the ultimate rules that Bitcoiners must follow when interacting with Bitcoin network. The attacks that can be done to create very problematic blocks for Bitcoin. I think the three that I actually needed to care about for Slipstream were the time warp attack, the quadratic hash problem, and the opcode separator. Both these are pretty well documented overall. The quadratic hash problem and opcode separator were pretty easily solvable. The time warp attack, I don't think I could have implemented a solution to that would essentially not risk Marathon mining an invalid block or orphaning or forking themselves off the network with some block that they didn't say was valid, and they start mining on top of some old tip, right? So
yeah, but the time warp attack is like more systemic across the network still. So
yes, it is literally the manipulation of timestamps, and we can go into that as part of the testnet attack Jameson Lopp did. But yeah, moving forward, the ultimate thing about Slipstream was, first of all, mitigating bad blocks that would actually attack Bitcoin from a DOS perspective. DOS is denial of service. This is when you can deny nodes the service of being a Bitcoin node. And so with that said, I don't believe that data on Bitcoin is a DOS attack. We have a block size limit for a reason. That's the limit. That's the DOS protection mechanism, is the fact that you can download this much data per, on average, 10 minutes. But the real DOS attacks I think are definitely problematic are outlined in the Great Consensus Cleanup. There may be others we don't know about. But with that said, those attack CPU cycles. So the block size things are arbitrary data. You're like putting more bits onto the network, right? You're putting more bits on the hard drive, but you can't actually make the node like utilize its CPU, the actual brain of the node, to do these calculations or be really slow so it can't do other things. It's just data. And yeah, basically the class of attacks that are absolutely actually problematic to Bitcoin are DOS vectors that DOS CPUs and the actual hardware processing things. Third, being generally nice to developers with Slipstream. So there are upgrade hooks in Bitcoin. For example, we use like op0, op1, op2, op3 for SegWit and SegWit versions, kind of like preventing people from utilizing those unnecessarily and building meta protocols on top of those opcodes that then developers are forced later on to go, well, we want the soft fork. Do we rug all these people? So as such, there's a few upgrade hooks that we left alone that you can't utilize Slipstream. You'll get a little notification, hey, don't use this opcode here. And that's as a courtesy to developers and just like making Bitcoin upgrades easier later on, so we don't end up with, well, an opcode separator issue where we want to turn it off, but we really can't because we don't know who's used the opcode because paid a script hash. And we, as Bitcoin developers, you don't want to soft fork anything in that would censor the ability for somebody to spend the money they've locked to that script.
In the competitive world of Bitcoin mining, one name stands out: CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner. At CleanSpark, efficiency isn't just a goal, it's our standard. Our sophisticated facilities are built and led by expert teams who care about Bitcoin and the communities we work in. Scale, we've mastered it. Our large-scale operations have set us apart in the industry as examples of community-oriented building. Our track record speaks for itself. We navigate the complexities of the new economy with precision and with skill, continuously achieving operational milestones. Curious about how we do it? We invite you to discover the story behind CleanSpark's success at cleanspark.com.
Not a lot of developers actually get to see a direct result in revenue to a company or their project or like whatever they're working on. But this is you have a unique position here where Marathon has generated millions in additional revenue, I believe, from this. I don't know what the actual number is. I don't know what the latest number is, but it's considerable. It's public data.
It is public data. And that's another thing about Slipstream. Like, first of all, like I wanted to build it to create like this freedom and Bitcoin being a permissionless protocol. If you have Bitcoin, feel free to use it in what way you can, as long as consensus is valid. But we also have made sure all the transactions at some point were paid in a block. It was not outside of the actual block through like, hey, send this to us inside of like a transaction. We'll put it in our purse, right? Everything went through a block. With that said, it's not millions. Yeah, it's been out for 2.5 months, and I do have the statistics available. The sum of all revenue right now that has been generated through Slipstream, 14.83 Bitcoin. I think at $70,000 a coin, that is close to $1 million or just over.
So yeah, if the Bitcoin price goes up another 5% today, you're looking at, a direct result of 7 figures, which that's pretty wild. Like not a lot of developers can say, I worked for X number of months. I use these resources. This is like the direct, like net additional revenue to the company. So, which is that's really surprising to me. It's also surprising to me that we don't see other people building this.
That was my, like, we'll get into that in a second. But yeah, like in general, yes, this has earned Marathon a lot more than I've gotten paid. So I don't really care because like I'm a contractor, and so what? I agreed to my terms, and that's the rules, right? If they make a bunch of money from it. But yeah, it wasn't hard to develop, and it was a very successful, it was and is a very successful product. The sum of profit, so we actually do keep track of this metric. So what mempool.space expects us to have had made for that block versus what we received, 10.511 Bitcoin. So multiply that times the exchange rate, $700,000. Like it's not too bad for okay, you got a single dev that literally just kind of like built this thing and like didn't blow up any blocks for Marathon.
It's a bit of a rhetorical question here, but some people ask like, why isn't everybody doing this? It seems to me like, aren't there just a bunch of Bitcoin developers out there? And isn't the business of block production one of like trying to, take any margin you can get? Like, what's going on here? Why isn't everybody doing this?
Like, I fully agree with that statement. So I think you're pretty well aware that Luxor pioneered the form hagger with the Taproot Wizards inscription number 652. I remember seeing that, and I was absolutely fascinated by that. Like, not the fact that it was a wizard, but like, why didn't more people do this? And then, so like back to consensus policy, And then from there, I realized like, oh, wow, Luxor is going to capture this market of basically these non-standard transactions. And then nothing happened. Like I think they've done a couple of them, but there wasn't a lot of activity there. And moving forward, yeah. So going into Marathon in November and realizing like, okay, there's hash rate here. Maybe I kind of want to create the product that I believe in as a Bitcoiner that Bitcoin should be. But second, like nobody else took that. Like F2Pool didn't take it, Luxor didn't take it. I had no idea why nobody took this. And so with that said, yeah, it just went to work. And like literally, I thought that this was a project everybody's going to copy immediately, especially going into the halving. Like everybody's got to be talking about these fees. Like, how are we going to earn enough revenue to pay for all this electricity? And so just like January, February, just full on race to the finish line to create Slipstream, get it locked and loaded. And yeah, I'm still fascinated that other miners didn't do that. And I think part of that potentially might be the outsourcing of templates to block producers, which I would say currently Antpool would be the most notorious because of 0xB10C's. I think it's like fork monitor tool. And basically what he does is he looks at kind of like the templates these Stratum pools are giving out to their workers and looking for patterns in them. And he noticed in the patterns that Antpool makes a template, and then a couple other pools have the exact same template. And when you build blocks, your node always is going to be a little bit different than everybody else's node and the transactions that are in there. So your template that you're building on, the jobs you submit to the workers, should all be different for each pool. No two pools should have the exact same Merkle root, right, to everything. And which it turns out that, yeah, like you had, I think, Binance, SBI Crypto, and a couple of brains on, especially the halving, 0xB10C, like live, played it. And he identified these things by colors. So if there's a pattern of colors, if the colors matched in the rows, that means they're using the same one. And you saw just like a list of like 8 different pools that all have the exact same colors as Antpool. So what that means is Antpool, along with making the blocks for their pool, are also selling block templates or providing. I'm not going to say selling. I don't know exactly what's happening on the back end, but they're providing that template for these other pools. And I think there are 2 reasons to do that. First of all, potentially literally just technical incompetence, right? So they don't know how to produce templates. It's easier just to ask some node somewhere else, hey, can you just give this to me? And second, maybe it's to mitigate the risk of missing out on fees. Because if you produce your own templates, like, for example, Mara does, you are responsible for when you make less fees or something goes wrong with a block. If you blow up a block because you decide to run your own template generator, your own Bitcoin core node, and you have people that are subscribed to your pool, how do you think, like, if F2Pool blew up a block? I guess F2Pool's blown up a couple, and it doesn't actually matter.
Yeah, they had that SIG-Ops one last year, but okay, yeah.
It's two SIG-Ops. But yeah, like, if these things go, and I think those are relatively unnoticed, but like Mara blew up a block back, and this was before my time, I just got to say. Like, I wasn't there when this happened, but yeah, they blew up a block, and it went all over Twitter that Mara had literally like imploded this block because they decided to reorder transactions and reorder. And if any other pool did that, and that got that much traction, they would have to make some sort of statement to their hashers going, this is why we screwed up. This is how we used your hash rate to mine on something that's garbage and isn't even Bitcoin. Why not just outsource it to Antpool from just an ops perspective of just make it easy? And then if it goes wrong with Antpool, it goes wrong basically with what percentage of the network is affected by this, like 30, 40% at this point. You get a little bit of leeway. So those are my 2 thoughts in regard to why other pools are using Antpool to produce templates.
Yeah, so we have, keep going.
And my final note is, if you're subscribed to a pool like Antpool to produce your templates, that means that you cannot inject your own transactions into that. So you can't run a Slipstream while also being subscribed to some other node's template generation services. That's just not possible. Okay.
Yeah, and so you bring up this this observation that this may be happening. Very statistically unlikely that these are not the same block template construction. But you also dial in on something which I'll probably resurrect from a previous comment we've exchanged which is developer resources and technical competence. I think this is something that I personally have been very surprised by, especially as over the past 2 years, I've been forced to be much more in tune with the technical community in Bitcoin. And I used to think, oh gosh, well, there's thousands of like incredibly deeply competent Bitcoin devs. Like you could just pull one off the shelf and hire someone and they know what but in as I have discovered, I think the landscape for even not just the average Bitcoin user's technical competence, but even the amount of developers who have a deep understanding of Bitcoin engineering is surprisingly limited. Is this your experience, and what are your thoughts on this?
Absolutely, 100%. Like, ironically, I didn't realize the value of my own skill set at all. Like, literally, I'd been doing open source contributions to Bitcoin Core kind of continuously for almost 2 years, 3 years before I got hired on with Mara. Mara was the first Bitcoin company I got hired on at. I was literally running my own startup, right? And it's pretty interesting because, like, this, I'll just say the story up front, that I gave them my rate that I would normally charge my customers per my normal company. And they just doubled it like right away. I was like, what? Like, can't you guys find like Bitcoin devs to do this? And they're like, no, we can't find any Bitcoin devs. And most importantly, ones we trust that can communicate ideas well. And so, yeah, that is. And then the calls that followed up post Slipstream about like people were interested, like, hey, I saw what you do. How can you work for us, or what can you do? We can't find Bitcoin devs. I had no idea that this was even a problem. I thought you could literally just go on Fiverr or whatever website and just go, yeah, I need a Bitcoin dev to work on it. That's not the case at all. So definitely understanding Bitcoin Core as a protocol and like just the concepts around what makes Bitcoin work in combination with specifically Rust, you can do really, really well, I would say overall. You got to be able to market yourself and develop a brand around your individual, like maybe something to separate you from the other kind of Bitcoin devs in that space, but you don't have a lot of competition. And my kind of final statement is that my education is all self-taught, right? There's no other industry that I could go into being self-taught without a formal degree and like all these accolades and stuff and get even remotely the ability to kind of have this much fun and do this much cool stuff with like exahashes, right? Like you're building templates for 25 exahashes, like megawatts of power. Like it's it's incredible because I have worked in these corporate cultures, right? And if you don't have a degree, that kind of like anchors you down a lot, or you don't have the skill set, or you got to work your way up like this like ladder of like accolades and certs and stuff. And maybe Bitcoin will become that one day. Maybe someday you will have to have your Bitcoin certs. Like you'll have to be certified to understand Bitcoin Core, Bitcoin protocol. But right now, like being self-driven and understanding Bitcoin, you can do really well. And yeah, you're 100% correct that the demand for Bitcoin or Bitcoin engineers is there. And I would say that, yeah, just you can't just be at the level of like, I'm using JavaScript to interface with Bitcoin Core. You actually probably could get decently far with that. But just like really understanding the nuances of like how Bitcoin Core works, and you'll do really well. So
I personally think it's about time Bitcoin engineers start getting dangled large checks in front of them, because I would love to see.
No, I think two sides to that, but continue.
Well, I just wish it were not such a binary choice to do Bitcoin and not make money. I wish there was way more ranges of like, actual profit incentive to go work on Bitcoin. But yeah, you wanted to reflect on that.
Yeah, I have some reflections, and that is personal biases, right? So I, especially after working for Marathon, like you have to make sure that yes, you're profit driven in terms of yourself, because you need to eat and survive, right? Like just live at least comfortably, definitely nothing too fancy, or be humble basically. But at the same time, like once you take money from an institution, I don't think there's any human way to get rid of the biases towards that institution. I've even watched my own like kind of mindset. I used to be a lot into the Bitcoin Core RPC and the function calls around that. And now basically the majority of stuff I'm working on is all mining related, because that's created this feedback loop of the more I work on like get block template, etc., and like get block hash and like all these functions, the better off I do. And like there's a direct like carrot on a stick. And so I got to be incredibly careful that I'm not becoming biased against like over time my own beliefs of what Bitcoin is. Like I need to make sure I still stay grounded in that and that the money doesn't create bad incentives to basically go directions that maybe even the free market wouldn't agree with. Like there are definitely Bitcoin projects out there that seem like they're parent companies like pushing rope, and then these things kind of waterfall into changes to like PRs and Bitcoin Core. Like we need this to do this kind of stuff. And there isn't actually any market demand for that. It's just a parent company who might be seeded, by some VC funding, or I don't know. There's just like basically keeping track of biases and understanding that by taking money from a corporation, you will become biased. And as such, the altruism that comes with just freely with your own extra time contributing to Bitcoin Core, that really, it doesn't go away completely. You just got to understand like how your kind of system will change when you get hired onto a company like this. And yeah, overall, I think so far I've done a pretty decent job at not trying to exert corporate influence into any of my Bitcoin Core PRs, which ironically I haven't had much time to work on lately because of the fact that I've been so busy with Marathon. So
before we get into the testnet, because I want to chat about the testnet.
Sure.
You said you get to do fun things with multiple exahash. Let's just talk about one or two of those fun things. The famous M block. I think it got maybe 1 or 2 days worth of like Twitter discourse, but like I think it's probably one of the most fun things to happen this entire year. Talk to me about the M block. What's the story behind it?
The M block, that was literally an overcommitment on my part. So I had just brought up Slipstream Core and released it, and we started using it on the template generators at Mara. And so we're running it live, and the CTO goes, "What can it do?" And I go, "Well, you can take in non-standard transactions, charge a little bit extra for that. You can also have a private mempool." And then he brings up like the story about like he went to a conference, and then he saw the mempool.space blocks on the screens or one of the TVs. He's like, "Can we draw a picture on a mempool.space block?" And I just go, "Yeah, we can do it. We got to be able to do it." Hardest project I've ever done in my entire life. Transaction ordering in Bitcoin is absolutely insane to get right. And so like overall, there were 3 runs at this that happened, and 2 failed. But the good news is they failed in such a way that nobody noticed or cared because there weren't massive failures. Then the kind of nice part about the M block is that if it's successful, it becomes a massive success, like all over Twitter, like it did. But if it failed kind of wrong, so aka the M was backwards, upside down, cockeyed, or it's flipped, you get roasted. You're done. Like Twitter is going to just absolutely nuke you. You're the OFAC company, blah, blah, blah. All these things like that they come out of this stuff. But if you fail really bad, it just looks like a scrambled block. So nobody kind of knows what you're up to. The other thing is not tipping your hat on testnet that we were doing this. So it like literally we went live with every single one. Blowing up the block wasn't a concern because all these transactions were injected through said raw transaction, which means that they did pass mempool acceptance policy. And then the last thing is, we had 2 choices between creating our own transactions and using mempool-based transactions that were already there. We wanted to use mempool-based transactions, and I had the code to do it. The problem with it, though, the fees were so low in the mempool, it was all green. There was no contrast. You couldn't make a picture because of the fact that the fees were 8 sats of eByte. But that also led into why it was so easy to do that stunt, is because if it is successful, you only forego like $7,000 in fees, and you get an entire 2 days of mindshare on Twitter, and you get to demonstrate the flex of like, this is our template generation capacity and Marathon. Like we have all these cool tools built from Slipstream. And so it was obvious that like, okay, let's just do this. I know there's going to be some people there are going to be some people that don't like it, but at the end of the day, there actually were monetary transactions in that block, but mempool.space only shows 7,396 squares before it truncates the rest of them. So there's actually another like 1,000 monetary transactions, or a third of the block that exists above that you can't see. And then the next thing is, we decided to use our own transactions because the mempool wouldn't produce enough color. Well, Marathon then has to like basically pay for those transactions because nobody else is going to pay those fees. And so you have to build these like exact transactions. They're all consistent, 7,396 of them. And there's some interesting things. First, don't lose the money. So with that said, you have a bunch of pre-signed transactions that are paying fee rates of like up to $130 a transaction or 2,000 sats of VByte. And so if a miner were to basically get a hold of your Stratum jobs, they could then kind of work and get one transaction, not too bad. But the worst would be a reorg. So if we did make the M block with those really high fee paying transactions, and just by chance, Antpool also mines the block. And the network accepts Antpool's block and our block. And next thing you know, Antpool's block gets mined on top of. Oh, so those transactions would all go back into the mempools of the nodes, get reabsorbed. And at that point, you would, well, the odds of Marathon just mining a block right after that are zero.
Is this a dumb question, but is there a scenario where Antpool might get the M block in its own block?
No, because the other transactions were such a low fee rate. It would be basically the really high fee rate, 2,000 sats of VByte, the 150 sats of VByte, and then the rest of their 8 sats per VByte, but the 1 sat per VByte ones, the green squares in that would all just get thrown away. And so, yeah, like they would basically walk away with like, I think a total value of like $130,000 worth of transactions. And of course, some teams on Twitter would get like, yeah, they took Marathon's money. Look at those guys. They screwed up. But at the end of the day, I actually used the filters to my advantage. I created, if you look at each one of those transactions in the end block, they're non-standard. They have double op returns. So that means if the block did get orphaned, those transactions, when they tried to get injected into the mempools of the other miners, would get rejected from that. And as such, I had the unilateral exit ready. So if we did have an orphan, I would just basically broadcast one standard transaction that consolidates all these, giving Mara their money back.
I feel like this is, for if anybody's managed to stick with us this far.
Oh, I apologize.
No. Like, I don't know how you explain this without getting super deep and technical. Like you have a lot riding on a lot of very specific,
nuances.
Like ordering of scenarios, and you're doing it with multiple exahashes behind you.
Correct.
This is like a golden era for experimentation in Bitcoin. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
It is a gold. It was the golden era, probably still is, but there are some other things that also allowed this to happen. First of all, the fees being so low, right? Like if the fees were actually like, let's say a Bitcoin in that block, Mara probably would go, no, we don't want to give up the fees to do this marketing stunt, but because it was so low, whatever, right? Second, the fees were so small compared to the subsidy. You're getting 6.25 Bitcoin for that block. So even if the M logo didn't work out, you still got a ton of Bitcoin. Like, so, it's a screw up, but it's not worse. So, but now it's 3.125. Okay. So the fees add up to be a lot more as a percentage. So experimentation is hindered a little bit more because can you actually afford to lose those fees for one block if something goes wrong? The answer probably still is you're probably going to be okay, right? Like it's still 0.1 BTC, not too bad. And then you get into the future where it's all fees. You won't be able to do this any longer because you can't afford to lose that kind of value with the hash rate. And then my last note about the M block specifically was the feedback mechanism. So aka ensuring your transactions were in the right position in the template because you had to modulate them in the order, right? So basically I had outlaid with the pre-signed transactions, the exact transaction IDs in the order from 0 to 7,395. And I would check the block template to make sure everything's lined up. If anything wasn't lined up, I'd wiggle it, basically adjust that fee rate by prioritized transaction until it fit into its correct slot. That's my final note. That was the last technical challenge, is creating a feedback mechanism to validate with 100% certainty that the moment that block gets mined, that it is going to be the correct output. Okay, that's all. So experimentation is limited.
Yeah, one of the things I keep telling people is like, I don't think Bitcoin is for JPEGs long term. I would like people to price out JPEGs. In the meantime, while we're not pricing out these transactions, we can still experiment, which has it's a double-edged sword. One, Bitcoin is perhaps on a slower path to realizing its fee revenue towards miners, but on the other hand, like it's it's kind of a blessing that we have this time to actually experiment, because I feel like there's been Bitcoin experimentation, but not at this like level. And I'm kind of surprised that, as far as I'm aware, nobody's like done this kind of stuff, even in Bitcoin's 15-year long history. So
I would say there have been some awesome experiments in the past. People are creating all sorts of interesting blocks. And there was actually an entire file system built onto Bitcoin in 2013. The guy basically in the outputs of pay to multisig wrote a Python program. So if you decode these addresses, there's actually a Python program in how to use the Bitcoin blocks as a file system. Back then, it's ordinals without the ability to transfer them. It was just data storage on Bitcoin. And it was used for actually a little bit, because I went through and I looked at all the non-standard transactions in Bitcoin that were using these kind of pub keys in multisig addresses. Instead of using those types of transactions for money, they're using it for data. And basically, storing data on Bitcoin has a history that goes back. It's not just now. It's literally been for ages. People have been storing data on Bitcoin.
this is fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah.
I thought I'd done like my own deep dive into the various ways people have used Bitcoin's, I would say, data layer, but like that is fascinating.
I was super excited to see that, because what happened was I wrote a PR basically to filter out stamps on Bitcoin and make them completely unspendable. So if somebody put a completely invalid public key in there, it marks it as unspendable. And so I went through and like, how many of these transactions exist on Bitcoin that are totally unspendable? You never could spend them ever. They're literally mathematically impossible. And then I get to like block out like 230,000 or something. And it starts like, I saw my script just start lighting up with a bunch of these transactions. Like, what's going on here? Who was doing data on Bitcoin back then? And then I convert these pub keys into ASCII. That's a Python file, and it's literally called file store on Bitcoin. Somebody like literally embedded the program into Bitcoin, and then you see there are files that use this file store protocol to be read from the Bitcoin time chain. And yeah, it's been happening for years. And yeah, it's just the white paper itself is embedded in Bitcoin, not using that particular protocol, but it uses multi-sig addresses.
I want to see you do a whole thread on this to like break down the obscurity, and you might call it Bitcoin archaeology, that you've discovered in your
Yeah.
travels along the chain. So I don't want to get too far. I want to talk about testnet, because this is one of the other, I think, underappreciated like side stories. Because I mean, first of all, like most Bitcoiners don't even think about testnet. They don't even realize that there are various nets to test. But you reorged an entire blockchain. You reorged an entire proof of work blockchain that we call testnet v4. And maybe talk about that first, but then pull back and then talk about like what preceded this in the discussion on Bitcoin's testnet v3. So let's jump to you reorging testnet v4.
Yeah. So reorging testnet v4, I got excited. So I saw on mempool.space at the top of testnet 3, because I'm always working on testnet. I saw at the top, all new testnet 4 came out. I was like, what? There's a testnet 4? And then I go in there and it's like an entire block explorer for testnet 4. This is interesting. And then I DM Mononaut and I was like, dude, what is this testnet 4? And he links me the PR on Bitcoin Core. And I was like, okay, cool. I'm going to run it. And then after going through and I look at the difficulty, I was like, whoa, that's a low difficulty. That's not very secure. And it's like, I've always wanted to do this. I've always wanted to know, can you go back to the beginning of a chain and redo all the proof of work? So basically, I mine a few thousand blocks in like a minute or two with an ASIC, an S19J Pro on testnet 4. And then I stop because like, okay, I definitely have enough hash power to do this. And so the first thing I do is I go into the Bitcoin Core node and I invalidate block number 1. So I just do invalidate block and the hash of block number 1. So that's not the Genesis block. The Genesis block is 0, but the first block I said it was invalid. That means that all the subsequent following blocks on that chain then become invalid to my node. So my node right now looks like it's at a height of 0, the Genesis block. Well, it's time for me to start creating a few blocks. And so I just fire up CK Solo. It's a free pool implementation you can download. I would highly recommend it for anybody with like a BitAxe that wants to actually do a real solo miner in a self-sovereign manner to use. But yeah, I point an S19 at this thing. And like within that, I had like 500 blocks, the 1,000 blocks. And I hit my first difficulty adjustment. And the nice part is it was building blocks so fast that the limit to the speed at which it could mine was the bandwidth, how fast it could interact with the network, not how fast it could hash. And so that implicitly kind of lowered my hash rate relative to what it would see. And essentially, the max difficulty adjustment upwards is up to 4x or add 300% to the current. So, okay, I mined my first 2016 blocks. Portland Hodl has to have his first difficulty adjustment. It increases by 4x or up 300%. And then it doesn't even slow it down. It's still moving, just turning out blocks. So I turn out another 2016 blocks in like another 10 minutes, no problem. So I'm at 4,016. I got to get to 7,000, like something. I'm posting in this like this group chat I'm in. And I'm like, I'm coming for your coins, like Rindell, Mononot, and all these guys. And like I'm post like every time I'm like mining towards that chain tip. And then, okay, start going, and then another difficulty adjustment. Now I'm starting to feel it a little bit. Now it's like 35 minutes for that difficulty adjustment to go through. And then to get to 8,000, whatever, then it was a little bit slower. And then after that, it started getting really slow. But I basically got to utilize that difficulty adjustment upwards in the limit to allow me to mine through those number of blocks. And of course, as I got the heaviest chain, my question is, what do the nodes do with this? Now that I've created this beautiful, very long chain that's longer than the regular testnet 4 chain, will the other nodes just willy-nilly download it and go, this is the heaviest chain, we're going to use it, even though Portland Hodl mined every single block to himself and now has over 1 million testnet 4 coins? And the answer is yes. All the other nodes very happily saw that I had the heaviest chain. They took in these blocks in order, put them together, and then deleted all the old blocks. And like in the morning, I saw like Monodot, those guys are like, my money's gone, and like all their balances show 0 because the chain, when validated against that, their money doesn't exist any longer. So that was my reorg on testnet. Second part of that, the good guy aspect. Well, game theory does play out a little bit here. I do want to keep my testnet coins. And if I was a bad guy and I reorg the chain, take everybody's coins, then they're just going to change the Genesis block before the release. They're probably going to do it anyways, right? But nonetheless, my chances are lower if I just give them back their money, right? And then everybody plays nice and fair, and I mine off of their tip, and I end up mining more coins that way. So what I did was I actually went through invalidated block number 2 on my own chain, re-accepted or reconsidered block for the one I invalidated previously. One node on the network still had the old chain. I picked that chain up, and then I started mining on top of that chain until it became the heaviest chain again, and thus replacing my previously attacked chain. Everybody got their money back. I ended up with 800,000, 900,000 testnet coins. Everybody's happy, but it was so exciting to literally just point an ASIC at a chain that had only been CPU mined. And what that like largely shows, first of all, why having the highest hash rate possible is the most important thing for any chain. Like you have to have a secure chain, because if you don't, you could just reorg, you could just rewrite all this data, all the monetary history, if you don't secure it via that hash rate, enough hash rate to ensure that the honest actors represent the chain, not the dishonest actor like Portland Hodl was on testnet 4 only. And by the way, like I fully intended on making things right. So, yeah, like just people should always think about that, especially with chains like BSV or BCH. Like, what happens if Bitcoin miners decide to just point their hash at that chain? Like, how long would it take to just reorg or just write empty blocks on top of the last checkpoint to where you are now? The answer is not long. 2 exahash is not enough security for a chain at all. So that's my testnet 4 exploration. And then, yeah, so I ended up the honest actor. I think I'm back to like 800,000, 900,000 testnet 4 coins.
Which I think is hilarious. I actually didn't realize you reorged yourself again.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really fascinating. And it's, yeah, I to your point about hash rate as a measure of security, there's been a lot of discussion on this, but kind of like even a lot of the software conversations, it's all been theoretical. It's all been papers and not a lot of actual implementation of what does it actually look like to reorg a chain? Have we actually tested whether the nodes do accept heaviest chain? We know you've got the rules in there, but like, have we seen it? What is the testnet for, if not to test and demonstrate these types of things? Which leads me to another the other question, that of testnet v3. There was some discussion of this on the Bitcoin mailing list. Jameson Lopp notably started doing what's called a block storm, I think. Is that the right term?
Yeah, correct. You basically can game the timestamps to do blocks really fast.
I want to try to explain, maybe kind of lower the education level here and explain what exactly was going on with testnet v3 and why we started to see Lopp and other people like Nick from Luxor Hashbender also jump in. Why was there interesting block storm production on testnet v3?
It was because of the difficulty of the attack. It's fairly low on testnet to attack testnet. And by attack, typically that is creating a bunch of blocks very quickly that have nothing in them. And so I guess a little bit of history is that recently some projects were asking Jameson Lopp for testnet 3 coins, and he gave them testnet 3 coins. They found out they're kind of actually running shitcoin projects with these testnet 3 coins and claiming that these coins had real world proof of work backed value. And that's not a lie. They are actually backed by proof of work. But the problem is the proof of work, back to my previous statement about security, it's basically like 3 S19s or $6,000 in machines that that whole network's backed by. There is no security to testnet 3. So moving forward, there also was another website that popped up, buytestnetcoins.com or something like that. And they were actively selling testnet coins for Bitcoin, giving testnet coins value. And that typically has always been the tripping point for, hey, we gotta take care of testnet. Let's nuke it and let's get the new one going after these coins accrue some real world value. You can't have that happen, and you got to enforce this to make sure that people don't ever try to give testnet value. You have to reset, blow away testnet. So what that means is that when you reset testnet, you start from zero, first block, and then you start mining all the way to the new chain tip. And testnet is for development purposes anyway, so who cares if it gets blown away? Next, Jameson Lopp exploited a rule in testnet called the 20-minute rule, and that is that if no block has been found in 20 minutes, the next block is allowed to be any hash. So that doesn't mean there needs to be a number of zeros or any difficulty to it. You can just submit a block, and it will get accepted. The reason why Jameson Lopp was so easily able to submit these empty blocks was he would create the empty block at basically right after a block was created, and then he would hold on to that empty block. And if 20 minutes had passed and nothing was there, he would submit that empty block with the bogus timestamp. And boom, next thing you know, he was able to get that difficulty adjustment to drop, creating a block storm. AKA, instead of having a nice consistent pace of one block on average every 10 minutes, he created several thousand blocks an hour. I think 20,000 blocks a day or something. And that's really hard on nodes because of the fact that these blocks are propagating through the network. They're validating, and some sides of the network are slower than others, and things are getting reorged on top of each other. And it created such a mess that even Mara does some internal testing on testnet, and he broke a few things. So yeah, at that point, it was actually really nice he did that, because we then realized some flaws in the implementations of software we have, or Mara has. And but yeah, essentially what he did was he created a lot of blocks really quick. And two, he created some timestamps in orders that, the actual time that is recorded on the block, it's not required to actually be accurate. It has to follow a few rules. But these were not accurate timestamps in these blocks, and that caused some other problems. So yeah, essentially, Jameson Lopp made testnet 4 unusable for quite a period of time. And now that attack is very well known publicly, and there are other people also still doing this on testnet. If you go to mempool.space right now, you'll see that there are a lot of empty blocks. They haven't gotten the same block storm that he got, where the difficulty moves really low, but it's still pretty decently problematic.
Yeah, and the reason, because he discussed this on the mailing list with some other notable Bitcoin devs on we don't want these testnet Bitcoin to accrue value. It's not good for the developer ecosystem. But if we reset it, we're not really solving the problem. You still have this malincentive, and what do you actually do? So my interpretation, without actually having spoken to him on this, was he's just going to make it unusable so that nobody can use testnet for a while, so that we just, certainly the degens don't have infinite money to go and do infinite degeneracy. Maybe we can just kind of help them, lose interest. That was kind of my interpretation of it.
I think that's really all you can do. And then second, mitigate these kinds of attacks on testnet for higher stability. So you can actually, because the next question is, how do you create a permissionless testing platform that doesn't just get attacked and destroyed, right? Like testnet
I don't know how, yeah.
Like if you want to test out merge mining for a sidechain, you have to use testnet. You can't use Signet. You need actual mining equipment running on that. The testnet's the only proof of work backed Bitcoin test network. Signet, it doesn't do that. And so the second thing as well is like if you want to test like block propagation, block connection times, etc., like testnet works really well for this also because you're actually interacting with real miners. A stratum pool implementation. So like let's say you modify your pool. Well, testnet does really good for that too. So you can't do these kind of things on Signet.
Need ASIC help? Check out Vitamine, one of Bitmain's certified repair shops located in Washington State with satellite offices in Colorado, Oklahoma, and Texas. PSUs, hashboards, immersion setups, in and out of warranty repair, Vitamine has you covered. Want to train your technicians? Bring Vitamine to your site for hands-on training in the art of ASIC repair, complete with Bitmain AMTC certification. Contact Vitamine today at dan@vmasic.com. Again, that's dan@vmasic.com. When you think of ASIC repair, think Vitamine.
So this was a really good conversation about Slipstream and testnet, but I have some other topics that I want to introduce. I want to get your thoughts on, and some of them can be a little spicy, but they're topics of the day, especially given that it seems to me that there is real material conversation again on Bitcoin Core, this topic of spam, the potential soft fork, even just Bitcoin consensus broadly. I guess I'll probably start with Bitcoin Core as you are a contributor and you spend a lot of time caring about this. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin Core and the current discussion on it?
I think Bitcoin Core is the best we have as humanity for reference implementation of Bitcoin. There is no better implementation. Slipstream Core, by me, it's not better than Bitcoin Core. Libra Relay, not better than Bitcoin Core. Knots, also not better than Bitcoin Core. Bitcoin Core is the reference implementation all these other forks derive from. The maintainers are typically the problem that people bring up. You got these 5 guys that are really trying, I believe, to be politically neutral and understanding the different sides of Bitcoin and the incentives that play into it. Like you have the devs who want to build tools on Bitcoin for scaling or fees or whatnot. And then you have the miners who want to extract the highest number of fees from the users. Like a miner, if they could, they would take all your Bitcoin, right? Instantly for every transaction. But they can't because there's open market competition. And then you have the plebs who are typically either economic actors via peer-to-peer electronic cash or the hodlers. And these guys are diametrically opposed with miners because guess what they would do? They would tell the miners, I want all my transactions for free. So with that said, I think the maintainers right now are tasked with a really interesting scenario of you have market demand for Bitcoin usage that doesn't fit within the standard model, right? Like, I don't think a lot of people thought that storing JPEGs on Bitcoin or using Bitcoin as an immutable data storage, highly available data layer was in anybody's kind of cards for this is how Bitcoin would be used, even during like 2016, 2017. And so now that there's demand for that, how do you basically not create MEV and a bunch of other problems with Bitcoin? I think they've taken the impartial stance of we really don't want to move in terms of relay policy, tightening things. But at the same time, we're not going to move in terms of tightening things, but we're also not interested in loosening things. Instead, we're seeing different problems being solved, such as cluster mempool, which was acceptance times for some transactions were really poor. And then just kind of other pieces, like I think silent payments has been worked on quite a bit lately. And just kind of staying out of the line of fire for these politically charged topics. And you'll kind of see it on the PRs in Bitcoin Core that when these kind of things get brought up, for example, there's a user by the name of RetroPex who did permit bare multisig to false. There is some really good content in there about like why we should disable bare multisig, why we should keep it allowed and relayed. But they become lightning rods for very emotionally charged discussion. And that kind of makes it hard to really dev on Bitcoin when you can't get high signal through because you have to wade through just 190 comments about people just kind of like, I believe Bitcoin should be used for this. This is my belief for Bitcoin. Bitcoin should be used for this. But at the end of the day, like at a technical level, it's a permissionless protocol. And as long as you follow the rules, it's still Bitcoin. So with that said, yeah, I do believe the core maintainers have done an excellent job at ensuring the Bitcoin network as a whole operates successfully. Bitcoin nodes for economic actors don't get DOSed or taken down by bad transactions, and miners continuously produce valid blocks on the network without forking it off. So I think they've done a great job. Like, I'm so thankful for everybody at the maintainer level. If you actually want to contribute and work on stuff, they will be there to answer questions. Like, literally, you can submit a PR, and it may take a while, but it will get a review. Somebody will look at it, make a comment. They may knack it and say, I don't like what you're doing. They may hack it, and then you go, yay, I've done something good. But they've been more than helpful. The IRC channels with the Bitcoin core devs, fantastic. And I think at the end of the day, some of the responses by, especially like Peter Woolley, if you don't like spamming your mempool, well, just enable blocks only. Just don't take in mempool transactions. Stop relaying. It's a valid strategy. So yeah, overall, Bitcoin Core is the go-to reference implementation, and nothing has shown higher stability, including BTCD, which failed twice in 2022 due to different issues that would stall out the chain. That's the back end of LND.
Oh, I didn't know that. I actually am not aware of that.
Yeah, so this is, can I go into a little history real quick?
Yeah, do it. Yeah.
So this precedes all of Ordinals by about 4 months, but Burak basically exploits the tap script size, and he creates a 998 out of 999 multisig that works on Bitcoin Core, but the back end of Lightning, which was BTCD, which is another Bitcoin implementation, I think it's written, I don't know what it's written in, but it's not Bitcoin Core. It's somebody else's like own build of Bitcoin, completely different language, everything. But the thing to understand is if you build a copy of Bitcoin Core in your own language, it has to match 1-to-1. Think of like an emulator for a video game. Like the original video game cartridge is Bitcoin Core. That's like the old Mario cartridge. That is what is actually Mario. If you build your own, it's an emulator, right? And so he exploited the fact that he had made a comment saying, hey, you guys have an issue with your consensus code for Taproot. If I submit this transaction, your node is not going to take it, and all the Bitcoin Core nodes will. And they didn't do it. And so next thing, he bribes a miner to make this out of band transaction because it's slightly too big. And he does a 998 out of 999 multisig, and he submits it. Bitcoin Core nodes keep on downloading blocks. BTCD, it stalls out. That's really bad if you're an economic actor. Like, he could have potentially done really malicious things to take people's money because he knew that he would be able to stall these nodes out. So, but yeah, that's why it's so important.
I mean, that gets into one side follow-up question I have just on client diversity. Like, I personally haven't really looked into a lot of the discussion on like what people think about libBitcoin, knots, core, and I use the term Slipstream core because I guess you've add your own
branding.
client to the Panther. Yeah. What are your thoughts on other clients and the roles that client diversity plays? Is a diverse client landscape good? What are your thoughts there?
This is very nuanced and tricky.
Answer how you feel. Answer how you feel. Yeah.
And even Satoshi said it. If you have a client diversity that approaches basically like 50% on each side, like let's say Bitcoin Core it loses market share to knots. Like knots starts like really taking off and people use knots, and you got like a 50-50 split. And like I said earlier, the video game, the emulator analogy, one of them falls out of sync with the other, and there's a block that's produced that, for example, maybe knots or core takes because of its policy that knots then rejects. Well, if half the economic majority is on one side, half's on the other, the hash rate is now split. You're mining on top of two chains. Whose chain do you orphan off? Like, which client has to move to the other to unify this thing again? Or do you accidentally, inadvertently, permanently split the chains from each other? That's the danger in client diversity, is that they don't all technically match. the idealistic approach is, yes, we should have an unlimited number of clients because everybody should be able to try their own thing on this permissionless network. And so, yeah, I do encourage anybody that wants to build alternative clients to do so. But understand, like, the level of responsibility you have for ensuring compatibility with the existing infrastructure on the network increases as the market share of your client increases. So basically, at Slipstream core level, which is one node that mines blocks, okay, let's say I screw up and we orphan ourselves off the network. Whose problem is that?
It's just yours.
It's just my problem, right? Somebody's going to be mad that they didn't get a block in time, but it's my problem. Now, let's say Slipstream core starts taking off like a lot and I at 30% market share and it stalls out. Well, that's probably more problematic because a lot of exchanges have built up this infrastructure and they could be working on the wrong state. If you got to go back and merge with the other chain because you're the minority, you have to go backwards. That leads to the chances of double spends and all sorts of problems like that. So there is some level of responsibility that needs to be taken if your implementation gets to the point where it's producing real world economic value and or as a percentage of the weight, which is impossible to objectively measure, of social consensus, not to fork off, whether it be intentionally or unintentionally, from Bitcoin, which right now is Bitcoin Core.
Yeah, that's such a nuance. I mean, I'm currently myself kind of working through how to ask and think about this topic. It's weird. You listen to 10,000 hours of Bitcoin podcasts, and not once will you encounter a discussion on client diversity. So
yeah,
it's such but it seems like it's more important than ever now because now everybody's, I don't know, it's now kind of a topic of conversation.
It's a topic of conversation, but the topic itself is mostly being lent to forks of Bitcoin Core. So what that means is Bitcoin Core is like the starting point, and then everything fractures off of that. So they're all using Bitcoin Core's code base. Same thing with Slipstream, same thing with Knot, same thing with Libre. They're all Bitcoin Core. So the chances of things actually at a consensus level forking and diverging pretty low. It's these alternative implementations with very small market shares right now, BTCD specifically. If that started gaining momentum, yeah, you could potentially, something goes wrong like that Burak incident where he deliberately said, hey, fix this. Otherwise, I'm going to show you how your implementation will fail and fork your users off of the network. And he did that. And if that happened and BTCD had a market share of 35, 40%, that'd be a bad deal.
So let's move from this idea of hard forks to the topic of the soft fork.
Yeah, let's go.
This is a popular conversation. You now have the ordinals, degens, and the Bitcoin technical community and the Bitcoin non-technical community all talking about this, all with very strong opinions. Mm-hmm. Lay the groundwork for what a soft fork even is, just for anybody who stayed with the podcast. And then, what does a healthy discussion on a soft fork look like in your mind?
Chaos. It needs, that's actually the most healthy part, is that it's still it's like complete anarchy, right? You have all sorts of economic actors, and the most unhealthy thing would be a unilateral top-down, hey, you're implementing this, like Ethereum Foundation style, this is the roadmap, that kind of stuff. You want these things to move very slowly, be very, very, very charged, right? Because what it does is it really keeps Bitcoin from being controlled by any one actor. And so, yeah, soft fork discussions essentially are people just talking about the soft fork. That doesn't mean anything at all. Literally, I could talk about a soft fork that doesn't even exist. It doesn't do anything for Bitcoin. Where the weight shifts, what actually is impactful in these discussions. Miners. When a miner says, actually, I should go back to the definition of soft fork.
Yeah.
You want me to do that?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, we're going to jump back real quick. I apologize for jumping
roll the clock back. No, it's good. I'm
used to discussions at a certain, sometimes I'm trying very hard. I apologize, Charlie, for that.
You're doing great, Portland.
Okay. So with that said, a soft fork basically is a change you can make to Bitcoin that people can install and run Bitcoin Core with this new change that will not cause it to be backwards incompatible with Satoshi's node, basically. The Bitcoin rules are still the same You've just done something nuanced or special with it, but it's backwards compatible. So what that means is, like SegWit, you actually increase the block size. You didn't force it, but there's a lot of nuance. It wasn't mandatory unless you're minor, but still, with that said, you added something new to Bitcoin. The Satoshi's node still, if he brings it up and he were to get on his laptop, he would still be able to get to the chain tip, and it would show the same number of coins in circulations, and the same UTXO set would be represented on his node. So that's really what it is. It's a change to Bitcoin that all nodes can accept and utilize. It doesn't mean that comes without like caveats. Like if Satoshi opened up his node and he saw all these SegWit transactions, he would go, what the heck, guys? Why are you Bitcoiners not securing your Bitcoin anymore? I see an op0 and then a bunch of characters after it. This isn't secure. I can spend these Bitcoins. But what happens is the social consensus of the code then becomes that, well, if anybody tries to spend these, we have an additional condition on these spending of these. Anybody can spend Bitcoins. You have to validate it with this witness script, the little extra condition. His node doesn't know about that. So his view of Bitcoin is slightly distorted in terms of how to spend, but it still accurately keeps track of the number of coins. So that basically is a soft fork in a nutshell. So a change that can be adopted, that is backwards compatible, that doesn't break other nodes from syncing with the main chain.
So let's get forwards to now we're talking, we've been having these soft fork discussions, which is kind of where we are. And then you now talk about where it gets meaningful is where miners consider the soft fork.
So why do miners have power in a soft fork? Well, they're the ones writing to the chain. They're the only ones that have the privilege of inserting rows into this database. By what I mean by that is like creating the blocks. A node runner that you run on like your Raspberry Pi without any hash rate attached, you can read the database. You can read the state of all things money, but you cannot add to that. And so when miners adopt soft forks, that means that miners are applying additional rules to the way they add things to the Bitcoin network. In SegWit, what they did was they said, hey, we have these anybody can spend outputs, but when we see one of those, we're going to add in this little additional validation where we're going to check for some extra data. And same thing with all these other soft forks as well. Basically, they're enacting additional changes, such as like in TapScript, if you see this one command, then you do opcat, right? And the other nodes will go, okay, I see opcat, but I don't know what it does. So I just assume it's true. This is like a nuanced part of that discussion. But yeah, the miners are the ones that enforce the rules of the soft fork and make sure they're enacted in combination with the node runners, right? They're like two sides because the nodes themselves also validate these blocks that come from the miner. So the miner can't just go, hey, I'm going to implement a soft fork, even though it's invalid Bitcoin, because they submit their block. The rest of the network is going to reject that block, and then they just wasted all that energy. So with that said, that's where soft forks at some point have to be enacted and validated at the level of the miners, because the miners are the ones that validate the blocks. Moving forward, the node runners also have quite a bit of power too. And so as a node runner, especially if you're an economic actor, right? So like a Coinbase or some guy who sells like t-shirts or something for Bitcoin, or a Lightning service provider, they can also kind of force the miners to enact these soft forks. And by saying, well, if you mine a transaction that doesn't do opcat right, my node is going to reject your block. That's the user activated soft fork. They're literally at the node runners saying, we're going to enact this because the miners aren't taking care of this. And at that point, you can leverage that to get a new feature into Bitcoin. I think those are the two primary sides to the weight of who can kind of make these changes to Bitcoin and how it gets done. Basically, the miners can start by signaling or enacting, and the node runners can then comply with the newer versions of Bitcoin or stay with their current version and just maybe have a little bit of a distorted view. And second, the node runners can enact these soft fork rules and force the miners to then comply, because the economic actors are requiring that the miners now enforce these rules for their new blocks. Because the miners obviously don't want to just start making blocks that don't go anywhere. They get burned or orphaned by Coinbase.
No, that's an incredible, fantastic explanation. I feel like there's not enough people who actually try to tease the concept of a soft fork out. And I feel that, when I hear other Bitcoiners talk about soft forks, they tend to have a just a very flat view of it. They tend to use the single example of the block size war as like the one, like this is how it looks. I'm like, that's how it looked then. I don't. This
it's going to be very
Bitcoin
different.
It's evolving all the time, and I mean, so speaking of the evolution, what's Portland Hodl's view on any software proposals? What are your thoughts? Where do you
Ossification
stand?
maximalist. No, I'm just kidding. This is probably going to make some people upset. I think most Softforks have had pretty poor unintended consequences in Bitcoin. Like some are really good, like check sequence verify, but specifically, like I'm going to reference SegWit. And from a technical lens, like you look at SegWit, absolutely an engineering marvel. But the social side effects of it, where you created a caste system for data, where certain data, well, you get 25% of the cost of other data. Like what? Like why is it this way? Like I know you incentivize certain things, but you did a mandatory block size increase for it. But at the end of the day, certain data is cheaper than other data. And okay, so you have this new kind of like rule that there's a way to get cheap data. Why did that play out to really benefit data storage and incentivize it? It's because if I send a monetary transaction today and I do a pay to witness public key hash transaction, about 20 to 30% of my transaction gets that discount. The rest I pay full price for. Now, let's look at the 4megger. You are like some JPEGger who wants to dump his data on Bitcoin because he loves his artwork. You know, this is I spent so much time on this. I got my extra Bitcoin because I'm an OG. Let's go spend some Bitcoin. Let's dump it on chain. Just rip the 4megger. What percentage of this transaction got a discount on the bytes he stored on Bitcoin?
100% of it.
Almost 100%. Literally, there's like maybe 30, 40 bytes where he had to pay full price on, but he got complete discount, or not marked up is the technical term, on those weight units. It's a pretty bad incentive for data storage and like how to use Bitcoin. And there's also some other like missteps, I think, which were like the use of like hashed address types as well to like store addresses. And then we realized at the social level, most people reuse addresses anyways, which gets rid of all the quantum resistant properties of that. And so you end up back at Taproot where you just have another pub key on chain. Taproot itself, X only pub keys. Like, I don't know. I just feel like we as humans attempt to do things and our scope as an individual or even a group of Bitcoiners is just too narrow to foresee all the possible consequences of a soft fork and like what it's going to do to Bitcoin. Overall, I would say Bitcoin is improving though. Like we have made the right moves, but there's no way to make a move that doesn't have some sort of side effect. And then so going forward, scaling, like that's pretty much like the argument that is used for a lot of these soft forks right now, like these covenants, CTV, OpCat specifically, check contract verify, vault, APO. Like you can get scaling outside of a block by creating these covenant locked UTXOs. And I think that we do absolutely need the tools to be able to do this, right? Like at some point, like there are going to be billions of people trying to onboard to Bitcoin over time. Right now, though, just looking at the on-chain metrics, let me just go to mempool.space.
They're down bad.
Hold on, I just want to make sure I'm being objective here. We're at 11 sats of VByte. The last block paid out $6,772. And let's see the most. Let's see here. One sec. Final one, data. And it looks like roughly 35% of the current block that's going to be mined is going to be data. We need people using Bitcoin as money. Like we need people to pay fees. We don't have a scaling problem in Bitcoin right now. We have a problem with people using Bitcoin. Even if you scale Bitcoin through covenants, I don't quite see how that is going to generate more fees, more people transacting on chain in the short term, unless there's some advantage to the settlement properties of these covenants that allow you to kind of do more. And yes, maybe ARC comes in and saves the day. Like one of these things does it. Maybe a sidechain, an L2, the data availability will start utilizing Bitcoin for kind of the money aspect. But right now, like I deep down think we don't have a scaling problem. We don't have 8 billion people knocking at Bitcoin store right now. we have an issue of like people literally just using Bitcoin for commerce. Like we need more people buying stuff with Bitcoin. We need more on-chain monetary transactions. The act of even competing with data to me is absolutely insane that Bitcoiners are having to fight at 8 cents per V or 8 sats per V byte with op return transactions. I did not foresee that going into Bitcoin in 2013, because in 2013, like I was doing it a little bit before, like the killer app for Bitcoin was the use of Bitcoin. Like everybody was, I could go online. There were marketplaces. I bought stereo amplifiers, computer parts. Newegg was taking it. Like Bitcoin was money then. And you had people using Bitcoin, and the fee market was pretty strong back then. And nowadays, just let's get those fees up. Let's show there's a lot of use of Bitcoin, and develop applications that really incentivize people to want to use their Bitcoin, even on chain. I don't like second layers, great. Like we do need that eventually, but right now, let's fill that block space with monetary data on chain.
I really, really appreciate that answer. I feel that rarely are there good advocates for maybe an ossification, but don't change anything yet. I think there's very few like well-spoken, coherent advocates for that.
I want to put a note. I definitely am not saying don't change Bitcoin. Like there are certain soft forks I'm more open to than others. I just don't think any are technically necessary right now. Like we haven't even beaten Taproot to death yet, right? And so like at that point, like what makes me more or less okay? And remember, I don't matter in Bitcoin. Like there are rules without rulers. Nobody actually matters. It's all a giant lark. Like technically as an aggregate, we do matter. But as an individual, nobody has any influence over the Bitcoin network. I'm looking for things that are kind of more specialized. I don't want opcodes or the softforks that introduce broad-based functionality into Bitcoin. I don't want Bitcoin to end up becoming yet another Ethereum, because of the fact that blockchains so far to me represent the fact they can solve one problem truly. That is money. And that's only through proof of work and actually backing it with the security of real-world energy. Everything else, I'm pretty sure a SQL database is more than adequate to solve the problems. Like Ethereum, you could do a SQL database, it would probably do the exact same thing. There's no reason to add blockchain to everything. But money, where transparency is the most critical portion, the only activity in human history where humans cannot keep their hand out of the box, the cookie jar, is money printing. You need full transparency and security to prevent money printing. That's what the Bitcoin blockchain does. It's very slow, but that's what it needs to be. And so adding specialized opcodes like CTV, specifically like the BIP 11.9 format proposed by Jeremy Rubin, I really like, because I'm not going to say like, I'm more open to, because of the fact that it lists out all the things it can do. And it's very tightly controlled. And so in my head, I can go, okay, the chances of me saying I like this and then later on going, oh, wow, I don't like that thing on Bitcoin are probably lower to me than something like OpCat that has a lot more flexibility to look at introspection and create different types of activity on Bitcoin and enacting or enabling that soft fork, and then going later on, I kind of wish we didn't do that. And like closing up that whole line of thinking, SegWit to me was kind of that exact line of thinking. I wanted it. I love the idea of SegWit, the kind of block size increase, the cell of the people basically be able to prune these inputs through the witness section, the increase in TPS. And later on, I realized like, okay, through other soft forks, including Taproot, it created some pretty poor incentives that led to my previous statement of we have Bitcoiners that aren't out competing data on Bitcoin because the data that people get discounts. Like, so I want very fixed opcodes.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I feel like a lot of us are unified on one general criticism of Bitcoin, which is that not enough people use it yet. And I think this, in my own personal kind of Bitcoin understanding and exploration, I've learned that, there's not that many Bitcoin developers. To me, we have a huge top of funnel problem for Bitcoin. And I think it should cause some self-reflection, which then leads me to one of my, I want to close this out with a really good, the way I was introduced to Portland Hodl, which was I was introduced to you as a Bitcoin educator. That was my, like the first, I actually read through some of your old threads or things you'd said in different places where you were explaining kind of very difficult technical concepts in Bitcoin. And I feel like a lot of the most hardcore Bitcoiners, the biggest passion projects we have are in education and bringing new people into the ecosystem. I kind of want to, so I would love to ask you some questions about how do you orange pill people? What are the effective talking points for you? And then what education topics do you think are severely lacking in the existing Bitcoiner knowledge base?
The first one, orange pilling. I don't think I've ever been good at orange pilling people, unfortunately. I'm typically pretty technical overall in my discussion. And one of the things, by the way, a little bit of background noise, I apologize. I work out of my kitchen. So
you're good.
Yeah. So with that said, most of my education is really focused around self-custody. That's the most important thing in Bitcoin, that you have a UTXO on layer 1, that you secure your keys, and really focusing on not getting scammed. So, and by scammed, I mean having your Bitcoin taken from you, losing out on buying Bitcoin because you end up, not you, but someone ends up buying a shitcoin. Like, why Bitcoin over BSV or BCH? Like I said earlier, you don't want to put your money in a network with 2 exahash of security. Like these kind of things. And then creating formats that are easily accessible to people, such as the slide decks. So I would create like these slides on Twitter, and ultimately analogies. So always trying to refine analogies to relate Bitcoin-based ideas to real-world things. That has always been kind of the go-to way to try to orange pill people. But at the end of the day, no, I don't think I've been the world's best orange pill. I think I've given a lot of people who are getting into Bitcoin that have been orange pilled by like the Jeff Booths, etc., that are really actually good at this stuff. Giving them tools to further refine their interest or satisfy that inquisition or inquisitiveness to dig into the box of what is Bitcoin at that point. What kind of hardware wallet should I buy? Like these kind of things. And that's kind of what I think I've been hopefully really good at, and especially through Twitter Spaces, where you can directly talk to people in real time. So if somebody doesn't understand what I'm saying, they'll literally come on stage. Portland, you make no sense. Tell me in simpler terms. Then we back up, and then we basically go back to the basics of.
This is where you get all your good analogies.
Correct, because if you say something that doesn't make sense on Twitter Spaces, guess what? Somebody's gonna come up. What did you say? And then you got to, okay, let's rethink this analogy.
So the follow-up question is, what do you think the existing Bitcoiner landscape needs to learn? What is not being communicated, or here's the term, what do Bitcoiners typically not grok about the very network that they love and promote?
Oh boy. Should I go with the dark Portland answer or the light Portland answer?
Start with dark, end with light. Do both.
Okay. The dark Portland answer: to make Bitcoin successful long term, it is technically already inevitable. But the ultimate scaling solution, or to create the scaling problem we're developing solutions for, Bitcoiners need to provide value. Like, they need to provide goods, services, things to do with Bitcoin, incentivize, take Bitcoin, do a marketplace, ask for being paid in Bitcoin for your work if you can stomach the volatility, like do things with this internet money, right? Like that's how value is. Money is worthless if you can't spend it anywhere. Like store of value, to me, I think it represents a giant trap, because if we have the store of value that nobody uses and the network's unsecured, none of it mattered in the end anyways. It would just be rewritten by ASICs. You have to have on-chain activity. And as such, just see, like, as a Bitcoiner, how you can provide value to Bitcoin. Like, really, like, can you program something? Can you ask for Bitcoin? Don't just buy Bitcoin and then literally just forget about it. Expect to sit on your butt in GU. It probably will do that anyways. But if you really want to put rocket fuel on that thing to make it go like that, find great use cases for Bitcoin. Like, use it as money. Find reasons for people to exchange with it. That's kind of the ultimate future for Bitcoin. I think, like, we really need the use cases on chain to truly fulfill my original idea that monetary transactions will outprice every other type of transaction in Bitcoin. That's the dark Portland answer. So
give me light, Portland. Let's end on a good note here.
Okay. Light Portland is that Bitcoin is inevitable. It's going to happen anyways. Like, it's literally the strongest money. It's backed by the most hash rate out of any chain in existence. Nothing has just the amount of energy going into it. Bitcoin is successfully operating day after day after day without failure. Bitcoiners right now are more engaged than they ever have been in the technical discussion of Bitcoin, right? So trying to shape their ideas and viewpoints. I'm watching the same people that came into my Twitter Space lessons to learn about how to set up their first hardware wallet, now discussing Softforks like OpCTV and OpCat. That gives me a lot of hope for Bitcoin, that we're going in the right direction, that people are really starting to understand not just that Bitcoin is something you were sold because of NGU, that instead it's about what Bitcoin is and what you want Bitcoin to become, because Bitcoin cannot be defined by any one individual. So that's what gives me hope, is that people are understanding more than ever what Bitcoin is, and that we're shaping the future of Bitcoin to be what Bitcoiners overall, the social consensus of Bitcoin, needs to be. Like, I don't know what that's going to be. Maybe it's an OpCat future. Maybe it's an OpCTV future. Maybe it's the existing hodlers go, we don't want to change anything. So that's what I'm really excited for, to see where all of this goes and what kind of things get built on top of Bitcoin. And ultimately, I'm looking forward to the day when this is me personally, of course, I see we actually really need a scaling solution now. Not like we have one ready, but like, we need this right now. Blocks are full, fees are like $250 a transaction. That is when like we have hit the mark, and then things get really exciting. And I do, like, last note, fees are inevitable. It's like, I don't know, like, it's gonna go crazy. It has to long term. There's no way you can have 8 sat per VByte transactions in perpetuity.
Yeah, it's like, how do you reconcile with the fact that you believe this is inevitable, but also like everyone should participate? Now we start to almost reprise some things in theology and philosophy, but we won't make that type of podcast. No,
I think I say it's inevitable for one reason. That government in of itself will dilute the currency to the point where Bitcoin is the only option. It's just the time frame and the pain you have to go through with that. The other side of like users needing to participate and interact with the Bitcoin network, that's just like the acceleration mechanism, right? Like giving it a little boost, pushing the throttle of the car, just not like letting it idle into success. Like really like being active about it will produce a quicker and better result, in my own opinion, than just hodl. Like, hodl's great, but also like use the Bitcoin. Like, it's amazing. Like, sending money to somebody for a good or service without a bank involved. There's nothing more freeing than that. Like, it's pretty good.
Well, Portland, I have been wanting to have this conversation for a long time, and I'm a huge fan of your work and just the way you position yourself in the broader Bitcoin discourse. Where can people find you? How can they reach out to you? And how can people do Slipstream type things with you?
So you can find me on Twitter, handle Portland Hodl. You'll pretty much see me with the laser eyes and my fiance, and should be right now about 7K followers, just in case you're worried about scammers. I do not subscribe to the blue check. I'm not going to be giving Elon any money. If you're worried, just send me a DM, and I will never, ever ask for coins, money, or anything, ever. I think that's pretty much it. Just follow me, Portland Hodl. I can, if you're really interested, slipstream.mara.com if you want to see the Slipstream portal and maybe even submit your own transaction. Don't feel the need to, though. Like, most transactions are non-standard, and it's more money. So, like, don't use the portal if you don't need to. Like, it's literally just there if you want to check it out and what it can do.
All right, fantastic. Well, I feel like we could have gone for a really long time on a number of subjects, so maybe we'll have you back.
I hope
later.
so, as long as I was cohesive enough and got together some points that actually mattered to you.
100%.
Okay.
So yeah, there's like innumerable topics that we could jump off from here.
I agree.
So anyways, otherwise, I'm going to play the clip and wrap this up. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Bitcoin Season 2, blockspace.media. Subscribe to the newsletter and check out our other podcasts, Gwart Show and The Mining Pod. See you next week.